Pilots or flight crews of Reddit, what went wrong on your flight that the passengers never knew about? I was giving my sister and a friend a tour of the Chicago skyline over Lake Michigan. We are all having a good time. Suddenly, the engine goes quiet. A nightmare, especially because I only have one of them. The silence was noticeable, and my sister looks at me and starts to panic. The engine comes back within about 3 seconds alive and well, and I head for the nearest airport. In a small propeller plane, it is hard to hide the silence of the engine, but since it came back, I acted like nothing happened. I don't think they realize how critical of a situation it almost was. Story 2. I was flying a Piper Navajo that seats 8 passengers out of a small airport. We were making all of our required radio calls. But because this was a small, uncontrolled airport, some people in small airplanes will operate without radios, or just don't care enough to broadcast their position. Anyway, we were doing our due diligence, but not long after takeoff, and while leaving the traffic pattern, my foe says, "Crap," and takes control from me and make a relatively aggressive, for passengers at least, turn to the right. As he does this, I see a Cessna out my left window no more than 150 feet below us. We essentially climbed through the altitude he was cursing at and turned to avoid him. Only one passenger noticed when we got to the destination, and he told us it was a good move. Good times. Story 3. Dad's a pilot, so I get to hear all of these. Good one that comes to mind. Mind you, he flies 737S for a major airline. Getting ready to take off at night, he sees a plane about to land on the taxiway he's waiting on. He immediately just starts turning on every exterior light on the plane. Other plane pulled out of final descent at like 500 feet. Talked to him about it. He said it was back when he was flying the 727. So about 15 years ago now. He remembers seeing the plane coming down, and the captain was looking back over his shoulder at another plane. So my dad starts throwing on all of the lights. At which point, the captain turns around and starts asking him what he's doing and sees the plane, and then both of them literally just duck and wait for something to happen, and after a couple of seconds. When it's clear the plane wasn't going to hit, they both sit up, and my dad starts trying to call the tower. The tower is just not responding at all for a bit. And then a lady comes on. The dispatcher had been a man, and basically says, "When you get to your destination, call this number." And the dispatcher and the pilot of the other plane both lost their licenses. Story 4. It was a flight from Kansas to Oregon, and as we were mid-flight, a Hawk damn dive bombed the wing and dented it. The pilot announced the subtle thud as minor turbulence, but the crew knew what had happened. No one knew how the hell the Hawk was flying so high. It was a smaller plane, so we only had 1.5 dozen people, not counting us crew members. The dent didn't actually meds with flight too much, but it's a hell of a story to tell. Story 5. I'm a bush pilot in Canada. I was working the right seat of a Turbo Otter, my first ever flight in one, so I was still getting used to the setup. We were taking off from a short strip in the middle of nowhere with 6 drillers in the back and a bunch of gear. Captain started the engine as I was just finishing up the passenger briefing. He started rolling down the runway as I was just getting seated. I thought he was just positioning the plane to prepare for takeoff, but then he gave it full throttle. I didn't even have my seatbelt or headset on yet. I'm focusing on getting this stuff on when I realize something isn't right. Getting closer to the end of the strip, Captain starts to panic as we aren't getting airborne. His hands were shaking like mad, and he kept reaching for things, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong. I think he was too busy looking at the trees and creek right ahead of us. I realized the problem. He was in such a rush to leave that he didn't do a pre-takeoff check. Propeller was still in full course, feathered on shutdown. It should have been full fine for takeoff. I yelled, gestured to him the problem, and immediately pushed the prop forward. Engine had a huge surge, and we just barely cleared the trees at the end of the strip. He acted like nothing happened for the rest of the flight. We didn't even speak a single word to each other. I suspect none of the passengers even realized what had happened and how close we were to being another statistic. When we got back to the airport, I told him I was leaving, packed my bags, and never looked back. Story 6. As a kid, 9 years old, I flew in a small plane with my Air Force dad and his friend. We lived in Minot and big base there, and were flying sometime in winter. Later, I learned we had such a long joy flight that day, because the landing gear froze up, and we were flying around trying to get them to come down. As we were almost out of fuel, they were planning to crash land on the frozen river, when in the nick of time, the landing gear unfroze and deployed. I had no idea, though. It was beautiful flying above a winter wonderland. Story 7. I used to do contractor maintenance work on aircraft, and once a bunch of us were returning from a job in Germany. The plane was a scheduled flight on a small, 50-seat or so, turboprop aircraft, and it was a bumpy flight. I am fairly well traveled, and working on aircraft made me more confident than most of flying, but the turbulence started to get so bad that I was getting nervous. Nobody except the flight crew were allowed to unfasten their seatbelts, and even they were being thrown about as they tried to move around. It was by far the worst flight I have been on. So anyway, just as things were getting to the peak of shiftiness, one of the stewardesses made her way to one of my colleagues sitting across the aisle and said in a hushed tone, "Excuse me, sir, Is it true that you guys are aircraft engineers? We have a slight problem out the back and thought you might be able to help. I honestly thought we were going to die, that the bumpiness was not down to turbulence, but some flight system had gone awol. I didn't know what the duck any of us would be able to do on unfamiliar equipment with no documentation. No spares and no tools. But sure enough, my colleague went off with the stewardess and disappeared through the door out of the cabin. 10 minutes late, he was back. And of course, we were keen to know what the problem was and if he was able to do anything about it. The problem turned out to be a ratchet strap on one of the cupboard doors, and the galley was jammed, so they couldn't get the snacks out. The flight continued to be horrible, and the snacks were predictably crap. Story 8, crap breaks all the time. Normally nothing so bad that the plane is going to crash, but important enough that we take some sort of corrective action. The systems in planes, I fly a corporate jet, are so redundant and interconnected that you don't always know for sure what's actually broke. Example, you might get a message saying that your ground spoilers failed, but you can look back and see that they're working just fine. Turns out it's just a sensor gone bad. But do you think I flew the plane again until that sensor got fixed? Damn no. So, to answer the question, they almost never know. They don't know until they get the maintenance bill. Story 9. Not a pilot, but used to do work on one's house. My favorite story was the time the heater went out in the cockpit, but not in the rest of the plane. So the pilot and crew are up there freezing, putting all their clothes on, trying to warm up. Instruments and whatnot are freezing up. They had no idea if they were going to be able to land. Story 10. Flight attender here. Metal shards stuck in the flap so it wouldn't allow them to be extended for landing. Declared an emergency landing and were met by the fire trucks. We were ready to evacuate just in case the shard got dislodged and sucked into the engine. Story 11. As a child, my family and I spent a few days in the Bahamas, and as we were at the outdoor airport, single runway, we discovered that we were flying an 8-seater single prop plane back to Florida. The first time taxiing down the runway, the pilots discovered something was wrong with the engine, so they pulled off to the side and made us sit next to the plane as they attempted to fix the engine. After being told that the plane was functioning again, we boarded and began to taxi down the runway again. I was watching the pilot and co-pilot do their thing when I noticed the airspeed indicator dropped to 0 as we were about to lift off. At this point, we were running out of runway, and I watched as the co-pilot jabbed the non-working gauge with his palm, and the gauge began to work again. The pilots then looked at each other, back at us, then back at each other before laughing. Story 12, not me, but my father. Years ago, when Dad was flying the 767 for Air Canada, they were coming out of London Heathrow back to Canada in the wintertime, and some snow had started to fall. Heathrow 10 years ago was notorious for letting a dusting of snow hamper operations. Dad and crew expedited boarding and pre-flight as much as they could and pulled the brakes and pushed back early to get ahead in the queue for takeoff. They couldn't get a taxi clearance right away, as a number of aircraft ahead of them had opted to wait for the heaviest of the snow to pass prior to taking off, and the controllers wouldn't move them out of the way. Dad basically begged them to move them ahead somehow, as he had been around the block a time or two and knew what was coming, but to avail. Ground had them park the airplane, and they sat loaded at the gate for 4 hours before all flights out were canceled. Over 4 inches of snow. The airport's inability to deal with the snow and backlog of traffic meant that Air Canada couldn't get a plane out for 3 more days, by which time they had brought extra aircraft over from Montreal to try to relieve some of the buildup. So in this story, what the passengers didn't know is that if they were maybe 10 minutes faster boarding the plane, they wouldn't have gotten stuck in London for an extra 3 days. Story 13. I wasn't the crew on either, but my service had 2 pretty severe bird strikes within several weeks of each other. One was a hawk of some kind, and the second was a duck. The duck strike happened with a patient loaded, evidently just as the pilot was flipping his NVGs up. The duck came through the windscreen and went to smithereens, along with all the plexiglass. I helped clean up the back of the helicopter later, and it looked like a duck had swallowed a duck of lit dynamite. The strike also happened at the exact moment the med crew had pushed a medication that relaxes all the muscles in the patient's body, including breathing muscles. And in spite of the chaos, they continued their procedure and successfully controlled the patient's airway. The pilot also continued the flight in spite of being covered in duck feathers. The crew, and the other bird strike crew, received commendations for their calm composure under the circumstances. It's pretty mind-boggling the damage a several-pound bird can inflict. Story 14. We were flying Dallas, Honolulu. We were about 30 minutes past the point of no return, and the captain informs us, flight attendants, that he had to shut one engine down because it was overheating. We had about 2.5 hours until we could reach any kind of land. We had a new hire, 2 months, working the flight that got very emotional and started saying things like, "I don't want to die," in a panicked voice. We had to shush her so passengers wouldn't start freaking out. As time progressed, I tried to ignore the fact that the other engine could crap out, or we could have a bird strike, or any number of things could go wrong. I started casually going through the cabin and rechecking all of the emergency equipment on board. To calm the new hire down, I took her through with me to try and remind her of her training. Just as she started calming down, I noticed a strange noise coming from the functioning engine. It was the sound it makes when we are changing speeds around the time we are about to land. We were still 1 hour 40 minutes out. The captain gives us another call and my heart sank. Just as he called, a passenger gets up out of his seat and collapses right in the aisle. His shirt caught on the armrest and ripped his shirt wide open. "Yifi," his wife screams. There are 4 flight attendants on this flight, so someone else answered the call from the captain and I had to deal with this. In my mind, I am thinking, how am I going to secure this guy if we are going down? Should I just leave him there and answer the phone? I need to know what the captain is saying. Meanwhile, the wife is trying to wake him up, and I'm asking my coworker to get medical equipment. I immediately switch to first responder mode once I see him turn pasty white. None of these passengers know about our engine problem, and only a few notice this guy passed out in the aisle. I saw him fall, so I was the caretaker. The runner calls for any medical personally on board and tells me that she can't call the captain because he's still talking to the lead. Oh right, we have that going on too. By the time a paramedic comes, the guy is waking up but says his chest is really tight. He's coughing and looks almost gray. We hook him up to oxygen and get him back to his seat. The paramedic says we need to land soon, haha, and get him to a hospital. As we get him back to his seat, I notice the lead flight attendant has a yellow life vest on and is coming towards me. Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. She tells me that the captain was able to turn the engine back on and that we should be landing in about an hour. We send up the message about the sick passenger. I know most passengers had no idea about any of this. I was standing there in the back galley sweating from helping this guy back to his seat, stressing about the poor new hire who we locked in the bathroom and just trying to gather myself. A passenger slowly walks up to me, stretching, yawning, pulls his earbuds out and asks, "How much longer? Are you guys going to come out soon with the drink cart? Can I have a Sprite?" All I could do was laugh at myself for getting so worked up. We landed with no incident. She was wearing the life vest because she was checking the demo bags, and these kids saw her and were curious how the vest worked. Story 15. Landed on the wrong runway. It was nighttime, and Tower didn't inform me of my misjudgment until less than 1/4 mile away. I was a young private pilot and had a few passengers, so it wasn't too big of a deal. Story 16. Not a pilot, but one of my buddies is. We were talking about one of the more remote airports that we'd both visited, located in a difficult place that has a lot of wind shear, so passengers are used to having the plane make a couple of attempts when landing. Anyway, my friend said the sensors for the landing gear malfunctioned, so he couldn't tell whether the wheels were down or if they'd gotten stuck. He flew low, made an announcement to the cabin that they needed to circle the runway because of the wind, and made a call to the control tower asking for someone to make a visual confirmation that the landing gear was fully deployed. Story 17. I was flying 2 of my friends back from some tasty BBQ in Georgia a few years back. As we got closer to home, the weather really started to get bad. A lot of pop-up storm cells. It was a perfect situation for my iPad, used for navigation charts, to totally die as well as my onboard weather radar. I was internally panicking, and air traffic control was my saving grace and helped me get home safe. A few months later, my friends asked the same question. They said I looked so calm, so they figured it was no big deal. Story 18. I was asked this question by a passenger while I was experiencing a problem with the rudder, brake pedals, and the plane I was flying. He basically asked what was the most urgent situation I had encountered while in flight. Little did he know that it was happening in real time at that moment. I had called the tower of my destination airport to report my position and request landing. As I'm going through my checklist, I positioned my feet on the rudder pedals to have authority of the toe brakes to slow the aircraft after landing. As I moved my foot on the right pedal, it sort of flopped forward. What does this mean? A couple potential problems, especially while on approach for landing. With the pedal flopped forward, it meant the top of the pedal would be pushed into the firewall and severely limit right rudder control. Not having bilateral brake control greatly increases the likelihood of a ground loop, or spinning out of control and flipping the plane over or off the runway. I narrated the problem to my passenger as I acted out the physical inspection to try to solve the problem. I reached down with my hand and flipped the pedal back up so that it was at least in the right position. Apparently, the linkage for the right brake had become disconnected. I knew that if I put the plane on the numbers, I had almost 5,000 feet to roll out and clear the runway for the next aircraft. I made an uneventful landing and just rolled and rolled with light left brake and some countersteering to keep the plane under control while it naturally slowed. The controller asked me to expedite clearing the runway, and I replied that I would, but I still rolled until I could just steer naturally off the runway. The passenger had no idea that I was encountering my first significant mechanical failure. I was just over 100 hours of flight time and working at a flight school as a dispatcher and front office person on Sundays. My passenger was someone that one of our clients had dropped off at another airport and was unable to pick him up. I told the guy I'd come get him after my shift if he'd cover half the rate of the plane of my choice. I was extremely familiar with the aircraft I chose, but a Cotter key failed and allowed the brake linkage to disconnect. Everyone lived. Story 19. My friend's girlfriend is a flight attendant, and she told us about a flight she had during the spring break season where a large group of frat, sorority people basically drank all the alcohol. That was on the flight, and they had to keep that from the passengers. After hearing about it, we made her watch the Wade Boggs episode of It's Always Sunny. Story 20. Girlfriend is a flight attendant, so I asked her for a few stories. 1. Upon landing, one of the tires blew out. It pretty much just resulted in a bigger jolt than usual, and although a few passengers commented on it, the crew just played it off as a more or less regular landing. Girlfriend. What are you going to do? Tell everybody a tire just blew and get them all panicked. 2. At least once a week, there's an armed plainclothes federal air marshal riding on the plane, usually in first class. They're there as a security measure, in case the cockpit is breached or something. Even if people are aware that air marshals are a thing, usually portrayed in Hollywood as escorting a criminal, they don't realize the frequency with which the marshals ride along on planes. 3. A guy on the plane was from a connecting flight from a Eurasian airline with a boarding pass under some other woman's name. The woman happened to be on the flight as well, so he obviously didn't belong. The guy could have stayed if he had just gone through TSA again, but he refused to go through the process and was very strongly insistent on talking to the captain directly. Big red flag right there. No idea what the real story was. She believes that it was a foiled terrorism attempt, but the crew treated it as a simple duplicate boarding pass problem. Again, the problem was dealt with, and you don't want to unnecessarily worry the passengers. 4. A lot of people try to join the Mile High Club, like a lot. Story 21. Passenger here. Last year, a guy passed on my cross-country flight, and they brought him back to life in the gallery with a defibrillator. We made an emergency landing at the closest airport. It was a really helpless feeling, but the phase, captain and foe, handled it in the utmost manner. Story 22. Not a pilot or flight crew, but once as a passenger on a Lufthansa transatlantic flight to Frankfurt, on a 747-400 on landing, I saw a whole bunch of fire engines and emergency vehicles surrounding the runway as we were landing. Now, this runway in Frankfurt has some glass-walled buildings next to the runway. In the reflection of those buildings, I could see all those fire engines and emergency vehicles were following my aircraft. For at least 30 seconds till the aircraft came to a stop, I had this sickening feeling in my stomach. But once the aircraft came to a stop on the runway, after a brief pause, we started normally taxiing to the gate, just like any other flight would. On deboarding, I could see the aircraft was still surrounded by 4 fire engines. Never knew what really happened. I later found out that aircraft was retired by Lufthansa a few months after I took the flight. Story 23. A collage of mine was flying with a captain who couldn't stop giggling since he got on board his 737. Only when they were cruising that the captain took out a yellow live baby duck from his flight bag. Couldn't believe the story, but the dude recorded a video of the little duck chilling in the sun on top of the mode control panel. Story 24. I was on a commercial flight, not a pilot, and the woman next to me was talking about how you rarely see other aircraft when looking out the window. So I explained that it's a big sky, etc. As we're coming into land, she looks out and goes, "Oh, look, there's a plane." So I lean forward to look at the window, and there is a C-130 coming right at us. Not like, oh crap, close, but close enough that I can identify it. And then our aircraft descends and flies quite low over the suburbs of whatever city I was connecting in that day. We land, and as we taxi, I see that there is an Air National Guard C-130 unit based there. We walk off and the crew is saying goodbye. I look at one of the pilots and go, "So, how about that C-130? Rapid change of his facial expression. Story 25. I had a medical emergency about a year or so back. It was hilarious. We were up in the air somewhere between Asia and Europe, about 9 hours in when Purser comes in looking a little worried while also trying not to laugh. Apparently, an elderly male passenger, in his 60s, was feeling rather uncomfortable because he hadn't been able to pee ever since we took off. We paged for any medical personnel on board, but knowing my luck, there was only an elderly German nurse who refused to see him because she is only comfortable treating women. So we started planning and briefing for a diversion while the cabin crew went to do their thing, in case his bladder decided to pop or something. Hey, we're no doctors. She comes back with more information, and we call our telemedical service provider up over SATCOM, satellite phone. This guy with a thick New York accent picks up, and we let he know what's going on, etc. It's been a while, but this is roughly what was said over the radio. Purser. Male patient age blah blah has been unable to pee for the last 9 hours or so, etc. Doc. Do you have a urinary catheter kit on board? Purser. Yep. Doc. Is there anyone qualified and willing to use it on him? Purser. No, Doc. Is he willing to use it on himself? Purser. Very. Doc. Well, tell him to shove it in there then. Purser and pilots, laughing uncontrollably. If I was drinking something at the time, it'd have been all over the windshield. What? Doc, there's some lube in the kit. Tell him to use the lube and shove it in there then. Just be quick to clean up because it could blow and get real messy real quick. At this point, we were all giggling openly whilst crossing our legs involuntarily on the radio. Good thing it wasn't over a public frequency. After taking a while to collect herself, Purser goes back to give him the bad, or good, news. She comes back later saying he actually did it with his wife helping him out, and he feels much better after doing it. Thar she blows. Story 26. A new private pilot here. Shortly after getting my pilot's license, I took some friends out flying in Cessna 172, a four-seater. I had trained on a much older and simple plane called an Aeronca Champion, a post-WIU trainer. I only had one previous flight with the Cessna, which was a 2-hour flight with an instructor, so I can get familiarized with the aircraft, and so the company that was renting it out can be sure that I'm a decent pilot. Anyway, after starting the takeoff, and right before reach the rotate speed, which is where you'd lift off, I moved my hand away from the throttle to double-check that my flaps were up. Pilots are supposed to keep their hand on the throttle unless they need to move it for some reason. Little did I know that this aircraft had some sort of that increases and reduces the friction around the throttle lever, allowing the pilot to customize it. So it's not too hard to move, but also has enough friction to stay in the location you leave it at, in my case, full power. Apparently, the pilot who flew the rental before me liked to have his throttle loose, I guess. When I moved my hand back on the throttle, I did not realize that it had come back about 1 second an inch. However, as we started taking off, I felt like the aircraft wasn't performing well, but I assumed that was because I was flying a fully loaded plane for the first time. We were almost at max gross weight. I continued climbing with the reduced power for probably 10 more seconds before checking the engine RPM and realizing that it seemed to be underperforming. I immediately pushed the throttle forward, and after reaching a safe altitude, I started diagnosing the issue and realized that to adjust the friction even existed. Anyway, none of my friends noticed. Had we had a short runway and a tree line to clear after takeoff, this would have been a different story. They still don't know, but one of my friends that was on the flight knows my Reddit username, so we'll see if he ever reads this. Story 27. I took a bunch of friends up at night to see the city lights. Unfortunately, the PCL, pilot-controlled lights, of my home airport, a tiny little airstrip really, but they did have runway lights, decided that was the night they weren't going to work. The airstrip was in the middle of a decent-sized patch of woods, and really only identifiable by the absence of light on a moonless, overcast night like that one, which made it totally impossible to find. Effectively, I was lost in midair. I knew the airport's bearings from 2 VORs, radio navigation aids, so theoretically, if I went to the intersection of the 2 compass headings, I should be able to see my airport directly beneath me. But when I did, it was still so damn dark that the ground might as well have been invisible. I had plenty of gas, and there were 3 or 4 airports in the area that I could have gone to. But it would have been embarrassing as duck to have to catch a cab back to where we'd left our car. So I crisscrossed the area a few times at low altitude with the landing lights on. To eliminate all glare, I turned off all the interior lights, leaving my passengers in the dark without explanation. Finally, I caught just the barest glimpse of the runway and took a mental picture of the setup. I flew an abbreviated landing pattern and lined up for final. The landing lights showed me as being slightly off, so I slid left every so little and then set her down nice and easy. I turned to look at my friends. They were as white as sheets. To them, it had been so completely dark that they didn't know whether they were 10 feet or 1,000 feet above the ground. They had no idea why I'd turned off all the lights and pulled power from the engine, and the bump of landing came as a total surprise. I laughed it off and said that I'd gotten lots of practice landing at airports with no lights back when I used to run substances across the Mexican border. For the longest time, I think they actually believed me. Story 28. Anybody who has ever flown into Juba, South Sudan, likely has a few stories to tell. Imagine an airport where there is one frequency with one guy manning it. This person is @is. Clearance delivery, ground, tower, and area control, and the airport is as busy. The only way to describe the radio work is complete anarchy. With everyone stepping on each other, you can easily go 15 minutes without getting a radio call in. Needless to say, Tisekis Ras are commonplace. Airmanship is abandoned. There's pedestrians on the taxiways and guys zooming all over the place with trucks and motorbikes. The taxiways are so congested with parked aircraft, you must taxi on the shoulder, straddling the taxi lights that do not work. Sometimes Tower will clear 6 or 7 aircrafts to enter the runway at once to let them all take off one after the other. It's really a special place, and a lot of crap happens every day that the passengers have no clue about. Story 29. The passengers knew about it, but I don't think they knew how bad it really was. I was a crew chief on an S-92 Healy, and we were evacuating some oil rigs of all non-essentials prior to a storm. It wasn't a hurricane, but they waited way too late to make the call. We ended up flying through some pretty rough weather all day, but it wasn't anything I hadn't experienced before. It was usually about a 3-hour round trip, so I always had a book to read, and all the passengers usually took a nap. And because of my position in the aircraft, I can't see anything forward. My view is strictly 3 to 8 o'clock. The pilot told me one of the cells were closing in around us and we couldn't go around and that it was going to get bumpy. I didn't think anything of it and continued reading. Normally, when we flew through clouds, it was still bright and, well, cloudy, like a thick fog. This time, it got dark, like thunderstorm dark. It started off with just a few shudders and a couple of big drops that would float you in your seat, and then we got hit with a wind shear. My head got slammed into the cabin wall, and then the aircraft pitched down and rolled left all at once as we pretty much fell from the sky. The co-pilot had controls when this happened, so he's yelling repeatedly over comms. She's trying to nose over. Everyone that was asleep was now awake with a death grip on the seat in front of them, wide-eyed and staring at me. All I could think was, don't look at me. I'm freaking out too. We lost a good chunk of altitude, but we recovered, and everything eased back into familiar territory. I'll never forget the abuse that school bus with wings took that day. It took it like a champ, but I sure as hell didn't want to put it to the test ever again. Story 30. We were flying a West Wind Eye into a small airport in LA and had to shoot a NDB approach, which is basically flying along an AM radio beam. We had just purchased a handheld GPS and the co-pilot was playing with it. While I was flying the approach and our cockpit instrument said I was exactly where I needed to be, the other pilot said the GPS must be a pause because it said we were a mile or more right of course. We double-checked our instruments and they were dead on. Stupid GPS. We broke out below the clouds, seems like about 600 feet ago, and the airport is about a mile off to our left. Power up, go around, and a nearby military base talked us down with a radar, ASR approach. We got out of the airplane and one of the passengers started talking to one of the people who met us about our adventure, and somehow it came out that the guys had been talking on the cell phones during our first approach. I went more ballistic than a corporate pilot should and gave him a lecture and let him know that he put us in a place with antennas that were twice as tall as we were high, and that if we were in the mountains, we would have been dead. Of course, he said he thought no cell phones was just a CIA thing for the airlines. We powered up the instruments and had him watch the needles while we made a call from where he was sitting, right below the antenna for the NDB, and the needles pulled 10 degrees or so when the phone was in use. Story 31. I'm not a pilot, but flying into Vegas one time, the whole plane rotated counterclockwise about 40 degrees while we were in landing approach. The captain immediately went full throttle, aborted the landing, and came around for another pass. He chuckled, little wind shear there, folks. Sorry about that, into the intercom, but I'm pretty damn sure he just saved all of our lives. I peeked in the cabin to thank him as we disembarked, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost and lived to tell the tale. Story 32. Many years ago, I was flying a medium-sized regional jet as a co-pilot. We were crossing the European Alps. The northern side had extremely crapty weather with severe icing reported, says you want to avoid with your plane. Southern side wasn't really any better, with at least slightly higher temperatures on the ground reported. To give some background, you want to prevent ice accumulation to your wing under any circumstances. Firstly, ice disrupts the airflow around your wing, decreasing the amount of lift created. Secondly, it increases your weight, which in turn requires you to have more lift. All transport aeroplanes have built-in anti-ice systems for the wings. Most of them work with the use of hot bleed air supplied by the engines. So there we were, cruising in the crap weather, trying our best to find an at least decent route through the zones with the least icing. No chance to descend below the weather, terrain, or climb above it due to aircraft performance. Next thing that happened was a bleed leak. Basically, very hot bleed air was leaking out of one of the supply lines for our anti-ice systems. Since hot bleed air can do a lot of damage to other systems, we were required to switch it up immediately, and hence lost all of our anti-ice systems. We had around 20 mens to the next airport while we could observe more and more ice accumulating on our wings. Wouldn't say I was scared. Still a view that doesn't really give you a good feeling. In the end, we declared an emergency. Once clear of terrain, descended ASAP and waited at a lower and warmer altitude until some of the ice dispersed. Landing was flown at a higher than normal speed, but none of the passengers ever realized any of that. Story 33. In PNG as an aviation curious PAX, flying out of Porgera Mine to Mount Hagen. We then used MilMe 8 for the bulk of transfers from site to Hagen. Crew of 4, CFO, engineer and a load, radio operator, all Russian, never happy-looking campers at the best of times. I'm sitting 2 rows back from the front. They pre-flight, get both turbines spooled up, and we lumber off and begin the usual brief fall down slope from the helipads, always a fun part of the flight. Looking forwards into the cockpit, and the moment we begin the run downhill, the C and FO start jabbering at each other, loud enough to be heard over the din that a Mi-8 makes, and pointing repeatedly at something on the dash. Looks as though the FO wants to go back, the CAPT wants to go on, and they're not really that focused on what we're currently doing. which is a long swoop down the mountain, and while the trees are still a long way off, they are getting bigger real quickly. The engineer sitting behind and between them puts his hands on both their shoulders, leans right over the top of them, and smashes the offending area of the dash with a meaty fist. Apparently, this was the magic sauce. The engineer sits back, the two guys in front give a little cheer, give him thumbs up, smiles, and ever so gently pull us out of what had turned into a, to the eyes of a passenger anyways, pretty energetic dive by that point. I look around behind me and there are a lot of wide eyes staring back at me. Faces frozen. Tense flight, that one? Story 34. I used to work at LAX, and there was, I believe, a 757 that had come in from New York, and the pilots had written up one of the engines having more vibration than usual. Maintenance ran it and didn't find anything wrong with it. So they loaded it up for another flight. After takeoff, they noted the vibration again. They didn't feel comfortable flying it, so they returned immediately. Maintenance ran it again, and as they were doing full takeoff power, the engine exploded. A turbine wheel let go and sent shrapnel all over the side of the plane. Half a turbine wheel went through the wing and fuel tanks, and the plane caught on fire. There were pieces of the engine all over the airport. I think it took weeks before they found one of the other turbine wheels that had crossed active runways. I don't think that plane would have survived the engine exploding in flight. It's a pretty big deal to return after takeoff. The pilots could have just said, "I don't want to deal with the hassle of paperwork, pissed passengers, angry management, etc., and continued the flight. But they made the right decision and saved the lives of hundreds of people. I tried to find a news story about it, and there was this tiny blurb in the local news and a quote from the airline saying something to the effect of, "There was an engine fire during a maintenance run and we will repair the plane and have it back in service." Yeah, right, they scrapped that burned out hulk where it lay. Story 35. Not flight deck, but I work in civil aviation. It's really not uncommon for planes to leak fuel when the engines first start, especially on cold days. Loading errors are common but rarely serious. Sometimes part of the aircraft is missing, and it will only fly at the engineer's discretion. Sometimes in that situation, the aircraft will continue to fly for a surprising amount of time before repair. Seeing these kinds of errors and malfunctions on a daily basis makes me feel safer flying, though. None of what I have seen has ended in fatality. Story 36. Wife was flight crew for a major U.S. airline. They were flying Atlanta to Amsterdam. Their aircraft had just arrived from Mumbai, and it was no exaggeration infested, filled with mosquitoes. Don't ask how, because I don't know, but they were everywhere. Worse yet, the airline requires flight crew to take a substance called Malarone when flying to Mumbai, due to the risk of contracting malaria. Since this was an Amsterdam flight, none of the flight crew was on the substances, despite the mosquitoes very possibly originating from Mumbai. They opened the doors to try to clear most of the insects before passengers boarded. They also called crew scheduling to try to get the flight canceled or the aircraft switched out. Their request was denied, and the flight carried on normally with the flight crew being furious. Wife also contacted the CDC, who requested more information. Apparently, the airline intervened and advised she wasn't allowed to file a report. This was years ago, and wife never got sick despite her and several crew getting bitten. The odds of contracting anything are probably infinitesimally low, but still it was the principle. Story 37. Not quite passengers, but I was in the Air Cadets when I was younger and got offered a gliding scholarship in the RF-powered glider. I was more or less ready to fly solo and was building up hours with the pilot in the seat next to me. Now I was great at landing, but always a bit ropey taking off. I wasn't steep enough. This time I pulled up and I hear the pilot go, "Good, keep this heading," so we climb to the height we were looking for, and I go to level out. The control column wouldn't move. I try again and it's definitely wedged. I give it a slight nudge back and it continues to climb. At this point, the pilot goes, "We'll go on level off then." So I told him it wouldn't level out, and his first reaction is to say, "Stop being a girl, it can't be stuck." I ended up telling him to take control of the throttle while I put two hands on the control stick and pushed all my weight behind it. I've never seen what I would consider a professional man look as helpless as he did for those few moments. Can't fault the guy, though, as he ended up landing the thing with the trim wheel. The other guys on the scholarship were a bit miffed when it was pushed a further week, as we had to ground all our gliders. Story 38. I was cruising in 35,000 feet in IMC conditions, in clouds. We had the weather radar turned on to check for thunderstorm clouds since there were reported thunderstorm clouds in the area, but the weather radar showed nothing. I was chatting with the other pilot when I all of a sudden started to hear small pling, pling, pling sounds on the fuselage. And then, before I knew it, we were being tossed around like nothing I've ever experienced before or after. I immediately knew that we had flown into a thunderstorm clouds and that it would make no sense to turn around, climb, or descent. We could only hope that it would be over soon. 30 seconds later, we exited the cloud and were in VMC conditions. Clear blue sky. I looked back and saw this massive ducker of a cloud. I still get goosebumps thinking of it now. That is the only time I've been really afraid in the cockpit. I informed the passengers that we had entered an area with unexpected turbulence or something. Lesson learned, always carry a fresh set of underwear in your flight bag. Story 39. I wasn't carrying a passenger, but I think it's a relevant story. I was 19 years old and had bagged myself a flying scholarship from the RAF. They basically paid for me to go to a civilian flying school for a month and learn how to fly. So I was out on my first solo cross-country flight, and about 20 miles in, was just about to make my turn that would take me over the Pennines, a long range of hills that form the spine of the UK, and being a diligent pilot, was constantly checking my instruments. All of a sudden, my oil pressure gauge just dropped to 0, and I quite rightly got a bit worried. I immediately turned around and made my way back to the airport. Whilst picking out fields where I could make an emergency landing should my engine suddenly stop, I made it back safely, taxied back to the flying school hangar, and shut down. I immediately reported the fault, to be told, "Oh yeah, it does that sometimes." I'm sure you can imagine how unimpressed I was. Story 40. I'm not a pilot or flight crew, but I'm an aircraft hydraulics specialist in the United States Air Force. Had a jet in flight emergency for loss of hydraulic quantity. Turns out, a clamp had broken on the side of the engine, and the pressure line from one of the hydraulic pumps had chaffed. Lost all hydraulics and had to use all backup systems, and the jet had to be towed all the way from the runway to the flight line. It was in a wax, so there is a rather large flight crew in the back that just operates the computer systems. I'm sure some of them didn't know that they were in such a critical situation. Story 41. Not quite an almost gone wrong story, but when I was 17 years old, I did some work experience with my uncle. He's an aircraft engineer in the Channel Islands. He met me in Southampton, and immediately we had some jobs to do, and he let me get stuck in straight away. The planes they used to fly in and out of the Channel Islands were these noisy AF tin can tree lander planes, 3 propeller engines, 1 on each wing and 1 on the tail, and my uncle was getting me to replace spark plugs, check bolts, and body panels, etc. Just small jobs. Anyway, once we were done, he just says, "Jump in. I hope you did a good job because we're flying to Guernsey in this." Really enforced the importance of scrutiny and precision in a job like this. Crap me up a bit anyway. These Trilander are sketchy enough, let alone knowing that at any moment a damn door could fly off because I missed a nut or something. Probably wasn't worth getting concerned over, but for my first flight in these things on my first day, I was bum-clenching for the whole journey. Story 42. I've had medicals on board where we're dealing with them in the galley. Going to get the oxygen and other passengers will stop me to ask me how long it'll take for their food to be cooked because apparently they've been waiting ages. Story 43. I fly giant airlines as well, so here is my take. Had a flight control failure over the ocean. Autopilot and auto throttles disconnected, but after rubbing checklists for nearly an hour, we were able to correct it and get them back, avoiding a non-standard configuration landing. Another incident over the South China Sea. Blew a pressurization valve and had to make an emergency return to Japan. We landed, and I guess some passengers didn't really notice. Many were surprised to wake up back in Japan. I guess we should have expressed that emergency notification a little better. Someone mentioned redundancy. This is true. Our aircraft has quite a few. Very often we get random issues that make us keep an eye on them, but nothing too serious. For the most part, if something is wrong enough to be serious, the passengers will know eventually. If it's nothing too serious, then there's no point in anyone else knowing. Flying is pretty safe. Story 44. A pilot I knew was flying a Piper Lance, small single-engine prop, 6-seater, and while taking off got a gear warning. Luckily, he had enough time to abort the takeoff, took the plane to maintenance, and turned out the gear was broken pretty bad, and he would have had to make some sort of emergency landing with a broken nose gear. There was a broken part of the gear that only became a problem after the plane reached takeoff speed. Story 45. While staring up into the rotor system one evening under nods, I suddenly realized there were 2 rotor systems. A VS-22 was supposed to land in the 3rd spot adjacent to us. Instead, they parked next to us with rotor systems running over our rotor system. We emergency engine shut down and ran, while laying in the dirt, both of us. Crew members asked each other who got the passengers. Neither of us did. We didn't say crap to them when we got back in. Story 46. Ground handler, Loadmaster here. Had a 727 come in once with most of a tree in the leading edge of the wing. Pilots were on approach and were too low while still being too far out. They knew they hit something, but they weren't quite sure what it was. Turns out, they clipped the top of a very tall tree while still being miles away from the runway. There was no reason for them being that low that far out. It could have been so much worse. Story 47. Was flying a CRJ-700 into Charlotte. The right engine started having vibration. Plane had just come out of routine maintenance. The vibration is enough to destroy the engine, but not really enough to notice by the passengers. Eventually, we had to shut it down and declare an emergency. But this was right before our descent into CLT, so we just descend and do a normal single-engine landing. Passengers never knew what a big deal it was. Story 48. I'm an aircraft engineer. What most passengers don't know that it is common or aircraft to fly with some systems inoperative. These are MEL, minimum equipment list items. So for example, the MEL will state what you must fly with, and this varies from type to type and airline to airline dependent on regulations, company policy, and if the aircraft is flying TOPS. Extended twin operations, basically flying more than 60 minutes from a suitable alternate in a twin-engine aircraft. So say one electrical generator fails on an engine. It may be possible to MEL that item and fly with the auxiliary power unit, the thing that makes all the noise at the gate, providing a second generator. It's very common that this sort of thing happens. It's not a problem so long as the aircraft meets regulations and is safe to fly. Story 49. Not aircrew, but engineering. But feel this may fit in. Also, Royal Navy. Many years ago, a colleague was working on the venerable Sea King helicopter, tough and reliable. But you cannot chuck it around like the larger, more modern Merlin that replaced it. So a hothead pilot does exactly that and lands it on the deck afterwards. This petty officer engineer is later seen barging into the wardroom past all the officers and deposits 6 very large and completely sheared bolts into this pilot's dinner. The entire main rotor gearbox, and thus the entire top end of the helicopter, are held on by 8 of these bolts. I am told the pilot went white as a sheet. Story 50. In the 1980s, my dad flew for a Canadian airline. The Boeing was used frequently on flights to and from India. They constantly had bedbug problems and couldn't get rid of them. A ton of them. They tried and tried. They had already spent thousands trying to fix the problem and couldn't when my dad asked the top-level brass if he could take the plane up to approx. 30,000 feet for 20 mines, empty of passengers, of course, and depressurize it. Pilots on oxygen units. It worked, thus killing everything inside, though lack of oxygen. Job done. Story 51. I'm a paramedic who works in the region of a major airport in Canada. You would not believe the number of standbys we do for issues with flights coming in, such as landing gear malfunctions. Part of the information given to us by dispatch include the amount of fuel on board and number of souls. These are generated by warning lights in the cockpit. Thankfully, 99% are bullcrap, because sending 1 ambulance and 2 fire trucks to a potential plane crash is completely useless if something actually happens. Story 52. Don't know how much of this next incident the passengers knew of, but Emirates Airlines are trying their best to keep a lid on it. A friend of mine works for them and says this last week on a flight from Dubai to Zimbabwe, the purser, the person in charge of the flight attendants, had a breakdown and tried to take down the plane. He hit the pilot and then went for the controls. Crew wrestled him down and had to restrain him. The flight was diverted back to Dubai and he was arrested. To date, I have heard nothing reported on the news. Seems they are trying their utmost to keep it that way. Story 53. Around 2005, I was on a commercial flight from New York to London. The plane was feet from landing on the runway. I was just holding my breath, waiting to touch down as you do, when the plane sharply pulled up and began climbing again. The pilot came onto the PA system and said in a very angry British voice, "Sorry, ladies and gents, not my fault. Theirs was another plane sitting on the runway." Clunk. Story 54. Passenger here. Was on a flight yesterday that felt particularly turbulent. It seemed like the pilot was turning the aircraft more than usual coming into land. Then we found out that we couldn't take off to the next stop because the left engine had failed. They didn't say so at the time, but I suspect the left engine stopped working in the air. Story 55. Former flight attendant here. I lived through 2 different total engine failures that were never announced to the passengers. Turns out one was because the aircraft mechanics had left a screwdriver in the engine. The other, I never learned why. And a few times we had to declare fuel emergencies, meaning that the plane almost didn't have enough fuel to land correctly. Story 56. Went wrong, but everybody knew. My father-in-law and my wife's uncle were asked to do a pass with their plane in a small local air show. They did, then came in for their landing, going through the checklist, nearly touching down. Then dispatch service waved off the landing. So they elevated to circle around and land. Dad raised the landing gear to do so. But since they had already gone through the checklist, they didn't do it again moments later, and landed the plane on its belly. Moral of the story, always go through your checklist. Story 57. I'm a passenger on the runway about to take off. Speed up, get 500 m into the air, hear somewhat loud noise, and land right after. Captain comes on comms. This is your captain speaking. Sorry about that. Turns out we left a window open in the cabin. And in order to close that we have to be on the ground. We will start taxiing for another takeoff now. Or something along those lines. The taxi wait was 1 hour long, and we had to do it again. Story 58. Father was a pilot. I heard with some of the first flights with the 777 for United that a crew had the engine go out and they didn't notice because it restarted. Wasn't till later the ground crew let them know. The rudder also autocorrects for loss of power. Story 59. Not a passenger plane, but when I was doing my first solo circuit in a 152, I opened one of the air vents, and instead of hitting the stops, it just popped fully out, and I was sat there holding an air vent and thinking if I should fix it or fly the plane. Always fly the plane, kids. Story 60. Nothing much, really. During training, so no passengers, I very nearly landed on the wrong runway at an uncontrolled but active, some traffic in the area, airport. My instructor, who realized this, stayed silent until I noticed the runway numbering on short final and pulled up for a go-around. He had a good laugh at that afterward. Story 61. I fly C-130S. Crap breaks on them all the time. Hydro leaks, malfunctioning props, avionics that just crap out, radios that won't work, bleed air that bleeds where it isn't supposed to. Not sure how many Foljays have rode on a military cargo plane, but you can expect something broke either immediately before or during the flight. Story 62. Flying my Cessna 182K, former, long gone now. Winter about minus 25 degrees. Had the cold weather caps in for engine intakes, but didn't have the oil cooler bypass. Took off. Oil cooler congealed. Oil temp kept climbing. Oil pressure kept dropping. Flying with my mom, told her we had to cut it short and return to the airport. Dead stick that ducker all the way in to save my engine. Story 63 was a passenger in a Pilatus. We taxied to the runway, then the pilot shut everything down, waited a minute, and then fired the plane back up. A bit unnerving starting a long flight in a plane that needed a reboot before it even got in the air. People who work for airlines, what are secrets passengers don't know? Story 1. As shown in some movies like Executive Decision and Passenger 57, there is a secret hatch on every plane that allows people to travel freely throughout the aircraft. Also, Wade Boggs once drank 50 beers on a cross-country flight and then absolutely destroyed the Seattle Mariners the next day. Story 2. If you checked your dog, there's about a 30% chance it's terrified before it even gets on the plane. Who knows how scared it gets during the actual flight? Bagroom agents will usually try to comfort a scared animal, but all we can really do is talk to it. So if you write your pet's name on their carrier, it usually helps a lot. I've never seen a cat who was scared in the bag room. Cats don't give a duck. Story 3. Air traffic controller here. Some of my favorite things we catch pilots doing is when they accidentally key up and give the cabin brief on the emergency frequencies instead of their internal comms. It's inevitably followed by a string of people keying up to say, "You're on guard," for about a minute. Story 4. During orientation, they told us to never get ice in your drink. They don't clean the ice bins ever. I watched in-flight place a fresh crab wrapped up in there in Boston, and it stayed in the ice until Oakland. They continued to use the ice for the outbound flight. Kinda gross. Story 5. Employees and their families get ID tickets. ID is for industry discount, which means they only pay taxes and fees and nothing for the actual ticket. The airlines basically lets them fly for free. And not just with their own airline, but with every airline in any alliance. The tickets are standby tickets, so you're not guaranteed to get on board, but you get a seat more often than not. The family members can travel on these tickets without the employee. My dad worked for an airline in Star Alliance, so I used to get free tickets with airlines in oneworld and SkyTeam as well as Star Alliance. I usually traveled in business class, all around the world. A return trip between Europe and Japan was something like $200 in business class, and maybe $50 in economy. I don't get any perks anymore, as it was only valid until I turned 25. Story 6. Paramedic here. If you switch on your alarm lights on the ambulance while being on the inner field of the airport, because, well, you just get there sometimes, they will totally shut down all incoming and outgoing flights until they know exactly what's going on. My buddy learned this the hard way. Needless to say, people got mad at him. Story 7. You know how all the other armrests can be raised except for the one next to the aisle? Turns out that one can be raised as well via a small button in a divot on the underside of the armrest. Useful if you want to spread out a bit more, though some flight attendants may tell you to put it back in place. Story 8. Locks on zippered bags are useless. You can pop a zipper with a pen and drag the locked zipper pulls around the bag to close them back up. I've done this many times to identify bags that are taggles and locked. Story 9. Ramp worker here. If by some chance your plane lands within the window of Air Force One, USA President's plane, everyone on the ground is not allowed to move. The whole airport is put on a ramp freeze. We have to just sit there for about 20 minutes causing delays for people waiting for their baggage, etc. Story 10. The coffee is absolutely disgusting because no one washes the container that goes out every morning. The station agents who get paid way too little don't give a crap about cleaning it. I certainly didn't when I worked for AIA. Also because we weren't given the proper supplies to clean it. We pretty much just rinsed it out and dumped coffee into it. Be nice to the ticket agent and they will pretty much always let you get away with overweight bags. If you were funny, I'd even not charge you for bags. Story 11. A Ryanair secret that was exposed in a documentary featuring undercover footage was that useful in an emergency types were encouraged to move from C to 1, I think, as people who sat in a 1, in the event of an emergency that threw them forwards, would be impaled on a metal lever in front of them. therefore tendering them useless to help others. Story 12. My partner worked for Delta for about 4 years as one of the guys who loads and unloads your luggage and waves wands. Nothing is safe in those bags. They pop open all the time and your crap just gets haphazardly shoved back in. They get tossed around like volleyballs. Say is a lie. A lot of decisions about boarding or switching flights, etc., are at employees' discretion. Story 13. Flight attendants have a list of who is who and what seat they are in, as well as what level of frequent flyer they happen to be, or if they are employees or family and friends tickets. This is why you will see them being rude to someone or bending over backwards for gits. Flights are routinely overbooked because there's an estimate per route of what percentage of people tend to miss the flight. So if you don't have a seat assignment, you might not get on, which is why they ask for volunteers. If you are a frequent flyer and know the busy times and flights, you could volunteer all day from every flight going to a hub and make $1,000 in credit. Invest in quality luggage. You are the only one that handles your bag with care. Your bag is going to take a beating in the system. Story 14. I'm an outstation mechanic for multiple airlines. I cover all flights at a major U.S. city airport by myself. Where to start? If your flight has a maintenance delay and there is no on-station mechanics for that carrier, I get called. If it's a quick fix, I fix it. If not, we check to see if it can be deferred to get fixed later. Either way, most of your delay is spent waiting on me to do all the paperwork to clear the aircraft or for me to finish the other 7 calls I'm out on to get to your plane. There is also constant pressure on both me and the pilots to clear fly aircraft that have some fairly significant problems. I have airlines try to get me to sell some pretty sketchy stuff to the pilots to get them to fly and avoid a costly delay. I have no problems telling a pilot to call his controllers, dispatchers, and tell them to duck off if I'm not comfortable with whatever concoction of deferral action I was asked to perform. Don't get me wrong, the airlines would never willingly fly an unsafe aircraft. But if there is, say, an engine vibration that is just right at a hair under the limit, they will fly it. If the oil is super low, but servicing it will cause a delay, service it at the next stop. If the pilot encounters something at altitude that I can't duplicate on the ground, sign it off and see if it happens again. Those are the ones I usually push back on, depending what it is. Also, if you have to get out of your seat so a mechanic can fix something, don't get about it. I get harassed all the time by passengers, even though my sole purpose is to get them in the air. Besides, I tell gate agents all the time not to load packs until I get out there, but they never listen. So go get at them. This is turning into a soapbox, so I will stop. Story 15. Sometimes your pilot can be on food stamps because they only make $19,000 a year. Baggage handlers see hundreds of bags a day. No bag is treated special unless it is obvious. Even then, depending on the person, sometimes they're not, which is rare. Bags are not intentionally harmed. They are, however, intentionally thrown, slid, jostled, stacked under hundreds of pounds of other bags, and exposed to the elements because that is the nature of the job. You can safely assume that your bag is touched and handled by at least 8 people per flight segment if you are connecting, at least 10 different people, not including TSA. Sometimes, the vehicle that fills the potable water for washing hands and making coffee is parked next to the vehicle that is used to dump the crapters and fill the blue juice for the lavs. They're not supposed to. Sometimes, they're parked at a distance from each other, which is policy, yet the guy who is filling the water is using gloves that he hasn't changed in over 2 years. The most power you could probably wield is Twitter. The employee in front of you has so little power to actually remedy tough situations. Baggage handlers are usually short-staffed. As well, customer service agents are usually limited in their options. Also, it would help us get a message to higher-ups because our work is not being supported as it should be. Damn. I'd even recommend asking an employee about the problem and say something like, if I were to take my complaint to Twitter, how could I phrase it in a way that would help you too? You get more customer protections buying directly from the airline. All those third-party travel sites are owned by the same company, and you lose a lot of the rights afforded to you in the airline's contract of carriage. If you're nice to people, they'll be nice back to you. Story 16. People fake needing a wheelchair to gain boarding priority. 10 wheelchairs get on and only one person needs it getting off. We call them miracle flights. Story 17. Worked on military aircraft, but it's something I've noticed pretty universal about jet engines in general. You have your auxiliary engine that runs while the aircraft is parked, providing power, hydraulics, AC, etc., while you're at the terminal. When getting ready to depart, you turn on your main engines. It takes a lot of power to get them started. As such, most of the auxiliary power goes to starting the engines. This is the point where usually you may see the lights flicker, and you will hear the whine of the main engines start up. The environmental control unit, or whatever they want to call it, stops cycling air during this start sequence. Without fail, if you watch for it, numerous hands will stick up and check or adjust the air conditioning vents as this happens. The air will kick back on when the engines are up and running. Okay, till, and had forgotten, jet engines use pneumatic power to start engines. I worked on jet turbines for turboprop. I have my manuals in storage, so I can't completely erase all doubt, but I do believe we used a hydraulically actuated starter. Story 18. Decided to make a throwaway for this, even though I'm really late and this will probably go unnoticed. I work for American Airlines as a station agent, meaning I do everything from ticket counter to the gate to baggage service. And there's honestly not much that hasn't been mentioned in this thread, but I've got a few things. Checking in on a kiosk will give you a higher boarding priority as opposed to checking in with an agent. If you check in at the kiosk, you get Group 2 boarding. If you check in with an agent, you get Group 3. You will even get an option on the kiosk to upgrade your boarding group to Group 1 for about $15, which is something an agent can't do at the counter. And no, I don't have any way of changing your group number for any reason. Contrary to popular belief, we aren't trying to give you a hard time about your carry-on bag during boarding. If we ask you to try your bag in the sizer, just do it. It takes 5 seconds. I understand that there's a big problem with consistency across the system. So some bigger bags will make it on board in one city but get checked at the gate on the way back. It's honestly really hard to catch every single bag when you're boarding 160 people. However, if it doesn't fit easily into the sizer, it will not fit easily into the overhead bin. If you force your bag in and break the bin, that's a canceled flight, a $10,000 fine from the FAA towards the airline and the station for letting your fat bag get through in the first place. On the same note, it's a complimentary check at the gate for your carry-on. That doesn't mean sneak a checked bag-sized bag to the gate to get it checked for free. I've seen this happen. Also, don't whine to me about how it fit on the way down. You're bound to add stuff to your carry-on or even pack it differently, therefore making your bag too fat to fit into the sizer. I'm not sure if this is system-wide, but I know at my station, we don't announce pre-boarding. I'm sure this is because just about anyone will jump up and say they need to pre-board because they've got a kid or something, which, 1, isn't fair, and 2, just causes a huge crush at the start of the boarding process. If you're traveling with children, chances are we won't let you pre-board, especially if it's a full flight and there are other families with children who haven't requested to pre-board. Again, not fair to the other passengers. If you or someone in your party needs wheelchair assistance at any point during your journey, please let an agent know, either at the ticket counter during check-in or at the gate. An accurate wheelchair count makes a world of difference for everyone, helps you get on board during pre-boarding, helps make sure you've got a wheelchair waiting for you at your connection and destination if you need it. When a flight's delayed coming in, meaning the inbound aircraft was delayed at its origination station, making it arrive late at the airport you're leaving from, which then causes it to be late leaving for your destination. We honestly don't know much about why it's delayed. We get a short blurb in the flight information in our system, like delay due to aircraft maintenance or delay due to weather between board point and off point, but that's about it. If the estimated time of departure is 4:15 and I tell you the plane is due in at 4:05, don't give me crap about how unrealistic the time is. Yes, I know that. No, I don't have any say at all in what time they put up on the screen. But we usually get a lot of manpower in those situations, called quick turns. So while we don't have much control over the deplaning of the previous passengers, we can get on that plane in a drove of like 10 agents and clean that bad boy up in no time. One more since this is running long. A little tip about what to do if you get your bag off the claim belt and it's looking beat up. If a handle, a telescoping handle on a rollerboard bag or one of the cloth ones on the side, or wheel well is broken, we don't cover that. It sucks. But we don't cover it as it can be seen as normal wear and tear, as those parts protrude naturally. If there's a huge gaping hole in your bag and the contents are falling out, go ahead and report it. You can report the uncovered damages as well, but it's not likely that you'll get any compensation for it. Those big damages, though, will most likely get your bag sent to Texas to be repaired, or a whole new bag if it's so bad that you can't even take the bag home. We have replacements in our back room. Story 19. Not particularly a secret, but one time I was upgraded to business class on a plane that was delayed for maintenance. Just settling into my middle row, aisle seat up at the movie screen. Bulkhead when a hatch in the floor of the cabin right at my feet flipped open and the maintenance engineer climbed up. He had a clipboard of paperwork for the pilot to sign, then climbed back into his hole, tipping his hat to the passengers before closing the hatch over his head. If you look for it, you can see a recessed pull ring in the cabin floor in front of the first row seats behind cockpit. 757 wide body, I think. Story 20. I am a gate agent for a large airline. 1, there's very little I know that I don't share with passengers during a delay. If the crew tells me the maintenance issue, I'll pass that on. I'm not hiding information from you. 2, I do fly for free, a lot. I know the major airports very well. So when you come up to my podium and argue with me that the 1-hour connection you booked yourself isn't going to be long enough, I'm going to roll my eyes and explain that yes it is. If you want time to leisurely enjoy an airport, book flights with longer connections. 3, the FAA. Dot are up the airline's asses about everything, from the handling of passengers with disabilities to how many delays we have. For this reason, we take extra precautions to not have any violations, some of which I can be held personally responsible for. Everyone on the plane arrives at the same time. Seats are assigned. So why on God's green earth are you all crowding the podium? Take a freaking step back. Seriously? If you're worried about getting a space for your carry-on, stop packing your carry-on so full. If it doesn't fit due to bins being full, I'll check it through for free. 5. Yes, the ramp crew and the jet bridge are checking you out. They're usually nice guys, gals. You could do worse. Story 21. Ramp agent currently bored and eating breakfast in the bar room here. If passengers are deplaning and we've already downloaded the aircraft, then I know 2 guys who will go hang out on the jet bridge and see who can find the hottest passenger. There's a lot passengers probably don't notice or know about those dudes on the ground tossing bags around. Story 22. If you're European, you have really, really good consumer protection against delays, cancellations, etc. If you're more than 3 hours late, your compensation starts at €250 and goes up depending on the length of your flight and the length of the delay. When I went to London a few years ago, my flight was overbooked, so I got bumped to a flight 4 hours later. The compensation I got was more than the ticket I bought round trip. Story 23. I worked for a US regional for a few years in various departments. Here's some crap. Asterisk. If your flight is delayed or canceled for things that cause the airline to be at fault, the airline is responsible for accommodating you. For example, they cancel the last flight out to your destination because the pilot called in sick. They now have to get you a hotel for the night and rebook you on the first flight out the next day. However, things that they aren't at fault for, like weather, ATC system delays, etc., they don't accommodate you. We ran very old aircraft that would constantly break down and cancel tons of flights, but we would routinely blame cancellations on ATC or en route weather because the passengers don't know the difference, and not only do we not have to accommodate them, now we can charge rebooking fees. Don't spend a lot of money on your luggage. Buy something that is cheap but durable. Those plastic-ish ones are the best in my opinion. Any kind of soft material will be destroyed by the rampies, guys who load the planes, especially if they have fragile written on them. They will toss them and drop them on purpose. If you ever hear a gate agent or flight attendant say Delta Bravo, that's phonetic for the letters DB. You might hear the gate say to the crew, "We have a Delta Bravo in 11 Charlie. Look over and see who's sitting in seat 11C. Yeah, that's the git they're referring to. The stuff other people said about traveling is absolutely true. It is hands down the best perk of any job around. I went from the US to Italy for $54 round trip. Almost went to Dubai, but that fell through. But it would have been $36 round trip. Tokyo was also $36. Anywhere in the USA was free. I've been around the world and back. I wouldn't change a thing if I could do it all over again. Story 24. All airline employees fly standby for free. Gate agents, rampers, mechanics. If they're an employee for the airline, they get unlimited free standby. So does their spouse, parents, children. Anytime you're at the gate and you see a list of standby passengers, chances are they're an airline employee. Also, you'd be surprised by how much stuff actually breaks on an airplane. Hint, a lot. Most of the broken stuff is insignificant, but every once in a while, something big, like an APU or a flight computer or the autopilot, will break, and the mechanics defer it to get the aircraft airborne. It's not unsafe, it's just more work for the pilots, usually. Story 25. This one is pretty much on its way out as a secret nowadays, but there really is no good reason passengers need to switch off mobile devices during takeoff and landing. The frequencies used combined with the lack of signal power in the antennae of consumer-grade mobile devices means there is 0% chance of them ever interfering with the plane's sensors and instruments in any way whatsoever. This has been tested ad nauseum since the beginning of aviation, mobile communication technology, and it has never shown to be a problem. Story 26. On larger aircraft, there are secret compartments where your cabin crew and flight crew are able to get much-needed rest. This is the flight crew rest on a Boeing 777, and it's located above the ceiling of the first-class cabin. There are 2 beds behind the seats as well as personal entertainment screens for each seat. This is the cabin crew rest of a Boeing 787, located above the economy class. Older Boeing aircraft have crew rest areas within the passenger cabin, and I've been told some Airbuses have crew rests under the floor. Story 27. My horse loves to fly. Most people don't know, but on the big jets that fly overseas, especially KLM to Amsterdam, the plane is only about 1 second, 340 full of people. The wall across the back has a door, and the horses are in containers on the other side. The owners, riders, trainers sit in the back row for access. There's a jump seat next to the door, and a KLM horse attendant sits there as well. When the Olympic team flew a few years ago, there were lots of horses, so they rented an entire FedEx plane. Most of them do very well and don't mind at all. Sometimes takeoff and landing is hard for them because of the G-force, and they sit down, but they go right back to eating after. We wait for about 8 hours in a hangar for a mandatory rest period, vet exam, and paperwork. Then they are loaded into containers which roll and lock into the floor of the plane. The people go through security while the horses are loaded in the side door. Then it's lots of hay and cookies for the in-flight service until they land, and we all go through customs and they have another vet exam. Then we get on a truck and go to the farm. The total cost is $3,800 for my seat, the horse, and customs. Depending on where you go and how long determines the quarantine period. Quarantine, pre-flight paperwork, and trailering to and from airport can cost as much as $5,000 extra. Story 28. I work fleet service for a major airline at a smaller airport. That means I clean your plane inside and out before it goes out. We clean your plane every now and then. It ranges wildly how long the plane has been out. Sometimes we would get a plane once or twice a week. Other times, it would be a month until we get to deep clean it. Quit putting your damn gum everywhere, you savage. It takes damn forever to peel that crap off. Quit using your barf bags to put trash in and stuff it under your seat. Why take the safety cards? We need those safety cards. Sometimes we clean only the back outside of the plane instead of the entire plane. Front ain't dirty? Why clean it? I get to sit in the cockpit and look at all that cool crap. Woo! I love riding in the bins. Story 29. I'm a semi-frequent traveler. I guess my info isn't really a secret, but I thought I would share because not enough people do it. Sign up for the frequent flyer program for whatever airline you book a trip on, even if you don't travel often. It does nothing but help you. Most programs have a merchandise service where you can buy physical goods with miles. So even if you don't travel enough to accumulate them, you can pick up a small item here and there just before they expire. Even if you only take a few trips in a year, you can accumulate enough miles in some cases to get a free flight or an upgrade out of it. Combine this with an airline credit card, and in most cases, your miles will never expire as long as you have the CC account, even if you don't use it. Also, there are some situational perks. In some situations, cabins have to be reshuffled around due to overbooking, a super elite booking, etc. In some cases, people in the economy cabin can get a free bump up to economy plus, business or even first class so that everyone gets a seat. In almost every case, they are going to look at who is a member of their frequent flyer program and give them the bump before a non-member. I've gotten a few free economy plus seats this way in the past. Also, by being a member, you usually get some priority in boarding, e.g. getting in group 2 or 3 versus 5. This, of course, varies by program. There is really zero negative to signing up. Story 30. If flights that are operated by a carrier that is based on an EU member, Lufthansa, and also flights that are operated from a EU member country, are delayed more than 3 hours due to technical or operational mishaps, you are entitled for monetary compensation, up €600 depending on the distance of the flight. Also, airlines have to give you meals, refreshments, and accommodation too, depending on the duration of the delay. 5 hours, meal and refreshments, a phone to call your family and friends, 8 hours, accommodation, and free transfer to and from the hotel. This is done regardless of the reason of the cancellation or delay. I see most people from the US are happy enough just to get to an hotel and they have no complaints whatsoever. However, if you ask nicely, they will most likely give you your compensation after the flight, if not immediately. Story 31. Not a secret, just common sense. The reason some bags miss their flight or get misrouted is because passengers don't remove old tags. It confuses handlers as well as the conveyor belt scanners. I see it happen all the time. Story 32. I used to be a crew chief, general aviation mechanic, in the military, then worked for a fueler at a civilian airport. I would walk around inspecting the aircraft and finding defects or just looking at parts and learning about planes I had never worked on. I found many defects on operating aircraft that in the military would have grounded an aircraft until it was fixed. I would always let the mechanics know, and every time the plane still flew. That said, the standards for military aircraft are way, way higher than the standards for civilian aircraft. We weren't profit-driven like the civilian sector, so we could afford to shut down a flight for a missing screw on a panel with 500 and swap everything over to another. The only one I think really irked me was an engine inlet rivet that had evidence of vibration because it had a trail of friction grease behind it, originating for it. I showed the XO on his walk around, and he said it's too late to do anything about it. I called up my mechanic buddy, and he said they were going to fly it and fix it later. Story 33. I work for a company that delivers the luggage the airlines lose, so not really for airlines per se, but I can tell you these things. Airlines lose way more luggage than you realize. Seriously. Whenever there's a delay or a cancellation or bad weather, whatever, we end up with hundreds, yes, hundreds of bags that we need to deliver just for the area we cater to, the southeast us from LA to EMS. Bags that are lost most often are duffel bags and awkwardly shaped or extremely heavy bags. If your bag doesn't fit conveniently into the Tetris-style arrangement the airline employees have going on wherever they put the bags, you're probably going to have to wait to get it. Southwest is run by idiots. Just saying. We get more cash on delivery bags. meaning that the passenger is paying to have the bag delivered, not Southwest, from them than any other airline we have a contract with. Also, don't put your important medications in your checked luggage. Just don't do it. You should expect that your bag will get lost and prepare accordingly, whether that means having a supply of meds on your carry-on or leaving a few days' worth of medications at home. Story 34. I work revenue management for an airline. On average, the cheapest time to buy a ticket is Tuesday afternoon. The cheapest time to fly is Tuesday, Wednesday, or Saturday. This applies to us flights in my experience. Story 35. Flight crews will have meetings before flights, where they discuss things like flying conditions, weather at the destination, alternate runways, etc. This usually takes 5 minutes. Whatever time is left before the flight, they talk about whatever they want. Some of them talk about how drunk they plan on getting later, how hot the flight attendants are, stories about passengers, and so on. Others choose to talk about hypothetical situations like what would they do if the plot of the movie Non-Stop happened on the plane. Also, there's a very good chance that if you wear a skirt onto a plane, a rampy is standing under the bridge looking up it. Just something to keep in mind, ladies. Flight attendants and pilots have read it. What are some things that happen mid-flight that only the crew are aware of? Story 1. There's a special frequency called GUARD that all aircraft are supposed to monitor. It's for emergencies, or for when an aircraft ends up on a wrong frequency and the controllers need to get contact with them to change them to the right frequency. It's full of pilots meowing at each other and people accidentally asking for gate assignments and making other radio calls. Story 2. I've had one near collision in my 11-year airline career, but have had a few TCAs, traffic avoidance collision system, warnings where the other pilot or myself, depending on who was flying at the time, have had to comply with the airplane's instructions to climb or descend to avoid another airplane. Story 3. Pilot here. We only get paid when the doors are closed and the pushback has commenced. If we're delayed or sitting with the door open, we're just as annoyed as you are. At altitude, we're constantly in contact with air traffic control and change to different center frequencies or control for other than US locations. We're also doing fuel checks to make sure the fuel burn isn't abnormal, dodging weather, and probably getting about scheduling. Story 4. An instructor told me that he and his training buddy both fell asleep for about 45 minutes at the same time while gaining hours for licensing. The plane was in complete autopilot mode, clear skies, zero turbulence. They both swore if they ever flew again, they would hand off sleep like handing off the controls. For further context, he told me that after both of them awoke, they were damn terrified. Neither had no idea what had happened, even if anything had happened. Luckily, it was over the Gulf of Mexico and at a low enough altitude where it wouldn't impact commercial airliners. Their trim was set before the nap, so they only gained a couple hundred feet of altitude. But rest assured, each were not happy with themselves. They immediately contacted ATC, verified their position, and turned around to go back to the airport, white palming the yoke the entire way. Oh, and this was at night too. They needed the night experience. They were in a Cessna 152. This wasn't an oxygen issue. It was just two buddies not communicating with each other and both assuming the other was flying. C-152S don't have autopilot. By autopilot, I meant trim, which would confuse people. They were also very lucky. The trim was set to gain altitude, not lower. I was just speaking in layman terms for the non-pilots to understand better. Like I said, they were definitely thoroughly freaked out and both admitted how badly they ducked up. Story 5. The scariest moment of my day is when the FA opens the internal bag door, the closet we all throw our overnight bags in, without calling us in the flight deck first. That ding and master caution gets me every time. Story 6. I've got an original one for you all. There is a radio frequency we all are required to monitor. It's called GUARD. It's for emergency use and is designed for maydays and for air traffic control to reach aircraft that may have lost radio contact, or to relay messages from aircraft to other aircraft, etc. Every day, this frequency is abused. You will hear hundreds of professional aviators meowing, yelling obscenities at each other, and making fun of one airline or another. Oftentimes, what will start it is some poor guy accidentally transmitting his PA announcement to passengers on the GUARD frequency, followed by the very mature outbreaks for about 10 minutes. It's the worst on the East Coast. Just today, I heard an airline aircraft trying to relay info about a medical emergency on this frequency through one of their fellow company aircraft. They couldn't finish any of their sentences without people yelling, "You're on guard? Hey, nobody cares about your passenger. Hey, you're on guard too, eh?" Story 7. My uncle was a pilot. He says that most people don't understand how much of the airplane is run by computers. The pilots are necessary, but a lot of the elements of flying are automated nowadays. Story 8. A former teacher told us a story that fits the question. Every year, he would make trips to Europe that were for an educational experience, or related to the subject he taught in one way or another. In reality, it was just an amazing way to spend 2 weeks in Europe. One year, he took a student's brother with, since he needed an extra person to have the minimum amount of required students. After the 10-hour flight, the flight attendant walks up to him and asks if said brother was a part of his group. He says yes. Apparently on the flight, he stopped the flight attendant and asked her to have sex with him in the bathroom. She denied, but he continued to ask her several more times through the flight. It reached a point to where she no longer felt anywhere near comfortable. She asked my teacher if she could notify the authorities and have him sent back to the States. He agreed. There were no immediate flights back home, so a distant relative of his had to be contacted. He stayed with a relative he had never even met for an entire weekend. He was then put on a flight back home the following week. Story 9. Flight attendants don't get paid on the ground. Only flying hours are paid. We are slave labor on the ground, and duties are continually added to our unpaid work time because the company knows they don't have to pay us. We show up 2 to 3 hours before we even start getting paid, and some days we will work up to 14 hours and only get paid for 5 or 6 of those hours. It should be illegal. Please be kind when you are boarding the plane and getting all about your bags, etc. The flight attendant is a volunteer while she is helping you on the ground. She's essentially doing you a favor. Story 10. This started off with us blissfully unaware, ended with mild pant crafting. I was flying to France in one of those planes with the TV screen up front to show the flight path and where you currently are. I was just about to fall asleep when the captain asked over the PA if there was a doctor on board and if they could go to seat. I knew this was bad. The flight path changed to Canada, and we had to make an emergency landing. We were stuck there for 2 hours. When we finally got to France, his entire row was quarantined off. I have no idea what happened. Story 11. 1. One split second of instinct combined with piloting skill decides if you land on the runway or on the side of it. Most of the runways are 45 meters wide, and on a gusty summer afternoon or during thunderstorms, I take God's name. 2. A smooth landing is not necessarily a good landing. One can make a smooth landing and it will feel good for passengers, but it could be a risky landing if the pilot decides to use extra runway. Never shout at your pilot for a bad landing unless he crash lands. And if he crash lands and you can shout at him, understand that you are alive because of him. Story 12. Pilot here. Most of the time, the passengers are not given the full answer on why a flight is delayed or canceled. Airlines will typically blame cancellations on unrelated events, weather, instead of mechanical issues so they don't have to pay for hotel rooms, meals, etc. Also, chemtrails are not real. For those of you who believe they are real, give your head a shake. Story 13. I worked with a pilot that was really old. He couldn't stay awake in flight. The first officer kept having to poke him and wake him up. We kept feeding him black coffee, but it didn't help much. I asked him if he was retiring soon, but he said he couldn't afford it because our airline has no pension program and the pay scale is pathetic. Pretty scary. Story 14. As an air traffic controller, we are constantly swearing and yelling at pilots when we're not on the frequency. And then when we key up, we use our nice guy voices. Story 15. We sat in a backed up queue for hours in Denver one time. The weather had the airport socked in. Nobody was going anywhere until this giant supercell cleared the end of the runway. During that time, suddenly there appeared a mechanic at the front of the cabin on the PA, holding up a 2-foot-long piece of metal he had pulled from one of the tires. He explained if the plane hadn't been sitting waiting, he might have never spotted it. It could have come flying out during takeoff roll and penetrated the plane's wing, igniting fuel or whatever. Everyone cheered him. What a hero. He possibly saved our lives. To this day, I have no idea why they let him come on board and tell us this. Story 16. One of my all-time favorites is the captain accidentally broadcasting his passenger briefing. Welcome aboard, weather in Chicago, and so on. On frequency, instead of the aircraft PA system, blocking up ground, ramp, tower, etc. For a solid 15 seconds, you automatically become the laughingstock of the airport. Story 17. Ex-airline employee here. Often we'd have someone on board with terrible body odor. You can set the temperature in one end of the cabin hotter, and it localizes the smell to one part of the plane. If you see coffee filter bags hanging anywhere, it's because someone smells like open ass somewhere on the plane. FAS often talk about the hot guy in 23B or whatever seat he's in. Pilots duck around a lot up front. They'll take pictures, post on FB, watch movies. Automation has taken over a lot of the work on long flights. Not really on topic, but don't ever walk barefoot or in socks on an airplane. The same mop that mops the lav mops the galley. Story 18. And my cousin is a flight attendant. It's not mid-flight, but airplane lines will fly attendants all over the country just in case they're needed elsewhere. My cousin had to fly out from Portland to Seattle and some other places all in one trip, never having to work. Also, if you are sick, you have to show up anyway and let the people in charge decide if you can fly or not. If you don't, you get 3 warnings, then you're fired. Story 19. I was learning to be cabin crew at college, and in the event that someone dies on board, the CCE, cabin crew, make it less obvious that they have passed. Put glasses on them, maybe a hat. Essentially dress them up as subtle as possible to not alert and/or panic the other passengers. Story 20. I was only a month or two out of IOE, initial operating experience, at my first airline job, flying right seat in a regional jet. I had just come back from the bathroom when the captain pointed that several flight instruments on his side had failed, and he had reverted to using data from my side, basically told his main flight display to start using data from the second independent system. Soon, however, that went bad too. The autopilot disconnected. And here we were at 25,000 feet or so, in icing, hand flying off a tiny little combined last-ditch backup instrument called an IIC, Integrated Electronic Standby Instrument if memory serves. We declared an emergency, asked ATC to point us in the direction of better weather, and tried to figure out what the hell was happening. Icing on both primary pitot tubes maybe, though that shouldn't happen, they are heated. In any case, we ended up making a perfectly safe landing after a diversion, and the passengers never had any idea that for a few minutes. I was really concerned that things were about to turn very, very bad and that we were down to our emergency backup gauge. That's the shortened version without most of the techno-babble anyway. Story 21. FA here. Crop dusting. Basically farting whilst we walk down the aisle due to the bloating. If you fly frequently, there's a high chance an FA has farted right by your head as they walk down the aisle. Story 22. Saw inside a cockpit when we flew back home from Orlando to Norway and the pilot was asleep. I kind of freaked out for a second, but the attendee said it's normal. It freaked me out too much. Then the second co-pilot waved at me and said hello in some other language. Story 23. Not an airline pilot yet. Just got hired by my first airline and start class next month. But I've been a pilot for 6 years. I primarily teach Chinese airline pilots how to fly, but I've done some passenger operations in business aircraft on the side. First of all the comments about pilots making cat sounds and Chewbacca noises is 100% true. Also, whenever someone leaves an area and switches frequencies, they yell, "See ya!" And then a dozen other pilots will key up yelling, "See ya," one after another. We also enjoy talking crap about people who say, "With you," "Got 'em on the fish finder," "Any traffic please advise," and "Tree" and "Fife." Also, the things that scare passengers don't faze the pilots one bit. We don't give a crap about turbulence or having to do a go-around. The things I don't like are things you generally won't know about. Thunderstorm dodging, microburst alerts, ice, maintenance issues, etc. Story 24. There's a 600-page book in the cockpit with every single thing that can possibly go wrong, from a bulb going out to an engine falling off, a biohazard or a bomb threat. Story 25. Career pilot and former instructor, check airman here. If you ever see a crazy and/or panicked passenger trying to open an emergency exit in flight up at altitude, don't worry. Just laugh and enjoy the show. They won't get that crap open. Guaranteed. Most airplane doors, EMER exits, etc. are called plug doors, meaning the door is bigger than the opening it occupies. At cruise altitude, a typical jet will hold a cabin differential of about 8 psi, their difference between outside air and inside air. So figure the surface area of the door in square inches and then multiply by it 8. The resulting figure will be in the thousands of pounds and no one will ever pull it open. And speaking of pressurization, I know all you passengers think you're breathing the same air for XX hours. That's true only to an extent. I think you probably get sick on a flight not so much because of the air, it's the things you touch. How often do you think the interior is wiped down and disinfected? Oh, sure, trash gets picked up, etc., but it's on the order of months between real cleanings, if ever. Know how you get off a plane and the hair on the back of your head feels greasy? Yeah. Jets are not airtight. They're pressurized, huge difference. We're pressurized because of a constant controlled leak through what is called the outflow valve. So you're always getting fresh air from the engines. Yes, that's right, from the engines. The engines compress air very, very well prior to burning the air with jet fuel, kerosene. Let's call a jet engine for what it is. One big open-ended diesel engine. Diesel, kerosene, heating oil, etc. all are very closely related. The air we use for pressurization, air conditioning, is tapped off of the compressor stage of the engine. And fun fact, it exits the engine toward the cabin at about 600 degrees. While jet aircraft have air conditioning packs, pressurization and air conditioning kit, and ACMS, air cycle machines. The pack is so good at what it does that by the time the conditioned air is entering the cabin, it's near freezing and has to be made warmer. Otherwise, you'd look like Jack Nicholson at the end of The Shining within about 20 minutes. Story 26. Former flight attendant here. Landing gear got stuck on decent. We flew in circles for ages, just waiting to find out if we needed to crash land or not. Luckily, the gear eventually came down. Passengers never knew something was wrong. One time, I accidentally spilled coffee creamer on a bald dude's head while he was sleeping during service. Myself and everyone around him silently agreed to say nothing. He looked as if a bird pooped on his head. I still feel guilty about it. Never drink the coffee. I've never seen those machines cleaned. Story 27. Ex-ground crew here. On a Boeing 777-300AR near the back galley, there is a hidden door that is approx 24 inches wide. Once you open that door, there is a small staircase that brings you to the crew rest area where there are a few beds. Story 28. Not a pilot or FA, but once when I was flying to Chicago, we had some mechanical problems. It sounded like an engine went out. The pilot got on the mic and said that the reverse thrusters went out in one of the engines and we needed to make an unscheduled stop somewhere in BFE. The plane landed, but took a really long time to stop. We all were put on another plane going to Chicago and were told to just grab an open seat. I later asked a pilot friend of mine about that. I wondered why a problem with the reverse thruster in an engine would be caused to make an emergency landing. He told me that it wasn't. The reverse thrusters get pressurized when the landing gear goes down, so they can't be used mid-flight. There's nothing serious about them going out that would require an emergency stop. He then told me that the pilot lied to us, as it was probably something much more serious like the engine going out, just like I thought. I might be a little wrong on the details since this was almost 10 years ago. Story 29. That the captain had a heart attack and passed away mid-flight, and he's the reason we have to have an unscheduled stop, not to refuel. I was a cabin crew back for a 5-star international airline. Story 30. Not a pilot and didn't happen in flight, but I saw the pilot watching adult film in the cockpit on a laptop when boarding the plane. Felt very inappropriate. Story 31. Pilot here. Guard frequency is basically pilot Reddit. It's just people meowing and making fart noises. It's literally set up to monitor for aircraft in distress, emergencies, or radios being in the wrong frequency. But it's so safe here in the US to fly that it's basically one big meme. Story 32. Definitely, absolutely, without question, a pilot. Spirit Airlines doesn't actually have planes. They put you in a bus and catapult it across the planet. An arguably more ambitious feat than flying a plane. Story 33. Flying Paris to Seattle. Normal, uneventful flight. I don't think there was Wi-Fi available on the flight. When we land, we are greeted by tons of heavily armed National Guard, police, TSA K-9 SES. The Paris terror attacks happened about an hour or so into our flight. Passengers had no idea that the attack had happened until everyone got cell phone reception and floods of, "Are you okay?" texts. I assume the crew knew the whole time as soon as it happened. Never said a word about it. Story 34. As a pilot, I can say that sometimes at a certain altitude you will see an evil clown standing on the wing. The best thing to do is ignore it and pull the visor down and try not to look at it or listen to its manic laughter. Story 35. My boyfriend is a pilot on a Phenom 300. People that fly in his jet are constantly having sex. They drink and have raunchy sex while him and his captain have to sit there and listen because it's only a curtain and not a door. They leave used condoms and cum stains all the time. He is the unlucky one that has to Clorox wipe it all off when they get out. Also, when his passengers are annoying and drinking, he will decrease the cabin pressure so the alcohol hits them much harder and they go to sleep. Story 36. Nobody is ever pronounced dead on a commercial flight. The crew will perform CPR until the body is removed from the plane. Otherwise, the coroner's office can impound the aircraft for days until their investigation is complete. If a physician on board declares the patient dead, well, bummer for the airline. More than once, I came into work to find a deceased passenger in the locker room waiting for the coroner to pick up the body.